Hello and welcome back to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and joining me here in the studio we have Spike's editor Tom Slater.
Hello.
And joining us down the line we have Spike columnist Rakib Ehsan. Hello.
Hello.
Coming up on today's show, the police killing of Tyre Nichols, Rishi Sunak's first 100 days, and Sam Smith and the nonsense of non-binary. So the funeral for Tyre Nichols was held in Memphis this week. The 29-year-old black man was brutalised, beaten to a pulp by 5 police officers, and he later succumbed to his injuries. Tom, there's a tendency when these horrible things happen to fold them immediately into a kind of narrative. Let's call it the BLM narrative that says it must all be down to white supremacy. Now, this case really doesn't lend itself to that, does it?
It doesn't, but that hasn't stopped it being folded into that narrative. And I think that's been one of the quite shameful ways in which this story has been discussed. Because as you say, what you have here is an indefensible act of police brutality. By all intents and purposes, obviously, these officers will stand trial eventually, most likely. They will no doubt defend their innocence. But a lot of people watching that video cannot help but feel that they acted in a not just brutal, but almost sadistic fashion.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some sort of traffic stop, which is escalated almost immediately. Tyre Nichols being heard kind of shouting out, almost confused and scared. You lot are really doing a lot right now. I'm not really understanding why they're putting hands on him in the way that they are. He manages to get away and then they just, wail on him, as you say. Later seems to succumb to his injuries. That should shock us enough. That should be enough of a spur to talk about how do we make sure that people like this don't end up in the police force. Where is this propensity for sadistic violence among a small but nevertheless, a quite dangerous proportion of American policing? Where is that coming from? How can that be curbed? What practices within the police force, what structures in society might be contributing to situations in which this happens, which is rare but is fairly regular in terms of them floating up in the news discussion. That's what a sane debate would turn on, and an important debate, one that could actually point towards some change. But of course, it hasn't turned on that. It's turned on basically this being presented as another example of white supremacist policing. The catch in this situation, of course, is that while Tyre Nichols was black, so were the 5 police officers involved in this altercation.
Yeah.
There are some white officers as well who are also being investigated, I understand. But in terms of the people in the body cam footage there that night were all black. Memphis police chief is black. The police force is 58% black, which is only slightly below the black population. So those arguments you'd think wouldn't really wash.
Yeah.
And yet, if anything, there's been a desperation to make sure that it is folded into that narrative. People dismissing anyone who are, shall we say, a little bit perplexed by the idea that 5 black police officers beating a black member of the public is an act of white supremacy, just dismissed as not thinking hard enough, not doing the work. You don't understand how white supremacy and structural racism actually operate.
You need to educate yourself.
Exactly. That's essentially the form that it's taken. And I think that's really unpleasant. I mean, first of all, you're exploiting a horrible killing for political gain, which should be shameful in any circumstances. You're also obscuring the nature of the issue. And this is a problem with we can get into this, but with the police brutality issue in general, it is not a strictly racial phenomenon in America. And that desire to racialise it, I think, has actually gotten in the way of constructive solutions and also sort of enough solidarity to deal with the particular issue. And I think the other thing is that it contributes to that kind of needless division and divisiveness on this particular issue. Whereas, given the fact that particularly young men of all pigmentations in America are well represented amongst people who can end up meeting a grisly end because of the police, this is an issue which you should be able to get broad-based support for reform, for pushing back, for change, etc. So it's shameful, really, I think. And what's striking is that the narrative, capital N, capital T, capital N, it can't even be dented in situations where the details don't match up to it, whatever, that it will just plough on regardless. And if you challenge it, you're the problem.
Yeah. Rakib, let's talk sort of generally about the narrative, so to speak. This idea that black men are being targeted by the police, being, slain, possibly are victims of a kind of genocide, according to the some more extreme voices in this debate. I mean, is that even true? Even putting aside an obvious case like Tyre Nichols, where this isn't white supremacy?
Well, the reality is when it comes to police brutality in the United States, it involves perpetrators and victims of all races. And that's why I think that the debate needs to be shifted more towards policing culture, and we need to get rid of this obsession with race. I find it quite remarkable that we have reached the day where left-wing activists are providing cover for 5 police officers for fatally brutalizing a man, talking about that they're part of white supremacist structures, that these black police officers were seduced by anti-black norms in policing. It doesn't have much of a high opinion of black people in general, I have to say, those kind of narratives, that they can be so easily conditioned and manipulated into lethal acts of violence against a co-racial citizen. It almost dangerously flirts with hard right narratives, which offer the dangerous view that the black race is of low intelligence, that it lacks mental ability. So I think that some of these narratives, they are laughable, but I think in some ways they're actually quite dangerous as well, Fraser. The point that I'd make is that when you look at trust in the police, it's also very low in working class, predominantly white neighborhoods in the United States, where there are many cases of police misconduct. So I think that what we need to do is look at the kinds of individuals who are being attracted to the profession. And if there aren't enough high quality candidates entering American policing, people with a strong moral character, sound sense of ethics, if you're not getting enough of those people, why is that the case? And if there are individuals with seriously problematic personality traits, brutally authoritarian traits within their personality, narcissists essentially, who may even see policing as a way to unleash their aggression whilst being protected by their profession, then we need to look at pre-employment psychological screening. To what extent are serving police officers subjected to regular mental checks by an independent authority, which is separated from police departments? Those are the kind of debates we should be happening. But I appreciate they may not be as glamorous and fashionable as the kind of identitarian chit-chat that we've seen since the death of Tyre Nichols.
And Tom, the BLM would say, well, actually, we have been calling for police reform. We've been calling for defunding of the police, or even abolishing the police was actually what where that argument started. People often like to forget that. Why is that not the way to go?
Well, first of all, it's the way that no one wants. I think people have seen the consequences of it over the course of the past 4 or 5 or 6 years, where the call to defund the police, and even when it hasn't happened necessarily on a kind of policy level, the kind of pulling back of policing from particularly high crime communities. So obviously there's very big problems with how those communities are policed. And I think in the case of this Scorpion unit, which is the body to which the unit to which these officers belonged, you can see these kind of cultures develop where there's a kind of sense of almost, there to sort of deal with this restive population rather than actually kind of policing people who are citizens in a community that you share and so on. But again, you see the call out to defund the police, and yet this is something, the consequences of that have been felt across the US in the wake of the Black Lives Matter riots and so on. There have soaring murder rates in many cities which had got that very much under control. And also this is something that's borne out by the polling and people's experience, because people in inner city neighborhoods, African Americans, they're not in favor of defunding the police. It's you see this in poll after poll. It's the college educated. It's the people who are better off, who are probably least likely to have bad experiences with the police, and yet want them to be defunded and so on. And yet the people who are probably more likely to have had some stories, had some run-ins, had some genuinely negative things, still recognise that policing is important, especially if you live in a high crime environment. So that's obviously not the right way to go. I mean, also it's the sort of thing where I kind of feel like the primary purpose of Black Lives Matter now, however we want to define that as a kind of nebulous movement, is just to defend the narrative, to maintain the narrative, to maintain this idea in people's heads that there is this thing called white supremacy, which is effectively kind of permanent stain on America and much of the West, that you can't get away from it, that even if you can't see it in certain situations, it's definitely there. So change either way seems almost not that important to them. That's kind of the main driver of this. And I think it's worth saying because, one can easily be accused of focusing on the extreme voices in a particular debate. The sort of person who gets booked to go on Good Morning Britain to talk about this and talk utter nonsense. But you were talking there about this narrative, this false narrative that it's effectively sort of open season on young black men in America. Open Season, I believe, is the title of the book written by one Benjamin Crump, who is the lawyer who's representing Tyre Nichols' family, represented George Floyd's family, many other families as well. This is someone who is intimately involved in these cases, really at the heart of this, the litigation and so on. And yet he is someone who will openly kind of fan the flames of division on that particular point. So it's not a fringe perspective, shall we say. And you do wonder as well just how this has taken hold, even though it kind of flies in the face of evidence and the data. I mean, there's been a lot of studies now, landmark one in 2016 at Harvard by Roland Frye, finding that if you control for all variables, black people are no more likely to be shot by police than white people. You also hear this refrain, I couldn't imagine this happening the other way. This was in a Van Jones piece on CNN this week. I couldn't imagine a bunch of black police officers beating up a white citizen in this particular way. And you hear that in relation to every essentially kind of instance of police brutality. I couldn't imagine this happening to a white person. And yet many of the big cases of deadly police brutality that we've all heard about and been shocked by often have kind of white counterparts in eerily similar circumstances. So with George Floyd, it was Tony Timper, a guy who was, again, pinned to the floor, knee on his back, who ended up, again, being killed as a consequence of that. There was a gentleman whose name I forget in Maryland who was killed in a no-knock raid like a couple of days before Breonna Taylor was. So there is all of these kinds of cases that bubble up, and yet, they can't dent the narrative. They get a fraction of the attention. And that's not to say, why aren't we paying attention to the white people? But it's to say that what you have here is, broadly speaking, not exclusively, but broadly speaking, a kind of class problem in America, and a problem, as Rakib was saying, of policing culture. And racializing it is quite possibly the worst thing that could have ever happened in terms of actually getting to the roots of it and sorting it out.
And Rakib, finally, I mean, there is this tendency to racialize just about everything in society today. I mean, how do we sort of break out of that impasse?
Well, it'd be very difficult. I do think we ourselves represent a cultural counter-challenge to that. I think that much of the contemporary left, both in the United States and in the UK as well, they need to rediscover their passion for challenging class-based barriers. And I think that's something that's been a particular weakness in recent times. Tom talks about the fact that the sort of brutalizing policing culture in the United States, it affects many working class neighborhoods across the United States with different ethnic and racial demographic profiles. So I also think that in the UK, we've seen many people treat a range of racial and ethnic disparities as direct byproducts of racial discrimination. And I think that what we need to do as a counter challenge is look at the myriad of social, cultural and economic factors at play and demonstrate the fact that this is essentially examining, well, I should say the term examining, is ultimately looking at issues through an incredibly reductive prism of race.
Sometimes it feels as if something new is being banned or censored every single day. I mean, we talk a lot about big tech censorship on this podcast, but old-fashioned book burning is alive and well too, sadly. So when I saw that Wondrium has made a 24-part series on this very subject, I added it straight to my watch list. Their series, Banned Books, Burned Books, Forbidden Literary Works, is a must-listen. It covers the history of book burning from the Reformation to Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses. And it looks at the controversies of classics like Huckleberry Finn and To Kill a Mockingbird. It even goes right up to some of the recent attempts to remove Harry Potter books from school libraries. And you can listen to that now on Wondrium. Wondrium is my favourite educational platform. It's full of great documentaries, series, lessons, how-to guides, and more. It covers just about everything you can imagine. So here's why you should sign up to Wondrium. There's a huge selection of videos, 8,000 hours worth. Plus, you can switch to audio only, which is great for multitasking or learning on the go. And the quality of programs is honestly superb. All the series are led by experts, they're easy to follow, and they're beautifully filmed. All of this is accessible from every device you can think of. I often watch or listen on my phone, but you can also watch on your tablet, your TV, or your desktop computer. There's no adverts, and unlike school learning or university learning, there's no tests or no stress, just the pure enjoyment of learning. So learn about what you love and love learning about with Wondrium. Do what I did and sign up for Wondrium now. Wondrium is offering Spike Podcast listeners and viewers a 23-day free trial, but it's only available if you sign up through our special URL. Go to wondrium.com/spiked. That's wondrium.com/spiked. That's wondrium.com/spiked. So Rishi Sunak has survived his first 100 days in office. He's at least he's doubled the time managed by his predecessor, Liz Truss, which is
damn him with faint praise there.
one positive, I guess. Tom, when Rishi came to power, when he was appointed as our Prime Minister, not elected, we were told that he was going to get a grip on things, that the adults were back in the room. It was going to bring an end to some of the Tory scandals that had dogged previous prime ministers. It was going to put the economy on the right track. I mean, how's that prognosis sounding now?
Not great, not least when you had the sort of economic indicators we're looking at now. I mean, you don't have to believe the recent IMF forecast to realise that we're in a bit of a hole. And also, there's no clear way out of it. You know, there is this kind of hunker down mentality, this idea that doing anything too bold in any direction is a bad idea right now because of the economic headwinds that they talk about as if they're kind of acts of God, and because of the mess that was left by the mini budget and so on. You have a kind of real downbeat sense of not really having a grip on the situation, just basically responding to events. I think it's interesting how when inflation was soaring not too long ago, again, politicians were blaming this all on external events. Now that it's projected to fall by half, Rishi Sunak is presenting that as a goal that he himself will bring about. Yeah. You know, that's something that's
one of his target. 5 big targets.
Exactly. Yeah. So you just really see a kind of muddling through. It feels like it's, economically speaking, it feels like it's the most explicit version of what basically successive British governments have been doing for a long time, which is not tackling the fundamental problems, not tackling the issues of productivity, not working out how to actually bring growth back to the country. Like this, he's almost like the most, just the kind of purest expression of that bureaucratic, technocratic muddling through. No big vision. All we've got to do is navigate these difficult waters as best we possibly can. And I think he's paying the price for it. I mean, I don't think that Labour are rising in the polls because Keir Starmer is a wonderfully passionate, interesting, dynamic individual with a clear plan for the country. He's making the most out of not just how the Tories have been blown apart by successive scandals and so on, but also the fact that in Liz Truss's and Boris Johnson's successor, they have this sort of non-entity, really. And even though Starmer's a non-entity as well, in the battle of the non-entities, he's easily winning at this point.
Rakib, let's talk a little bit about the polls because they're pretty disastrous for Rishi Sunak. I mean, particularly it seems as if the red wall that people have shown a lot of interest in, you know, the Tories famously won over at the last election. This is not a government that's going to keep them on side, is it?
Unlikely, if truth be told. I remember after the December 2019 general election, I wrote a piece for us here at Spiked, which talked about how the Tories had done so well in traditional former coal mining communities. And I thought that the big thing about our post-Brexit project, I wanted to see an active industrial strategy. So something about really bolstering British manufacturing, which has really suffered in recent decades, being a lot of communities being faced with the harsh winds of globalization, communities that have been hollowed out and have suffered quite severe forms of industrial decline. I just don't see any of that from the Conservative Party, if truth be told. They talk a great deal about levelling up the country, whatever the hell that means. It was just, but this was actually the flagship policy of the Johnson government, and it's just nowhere to be seen. So I do think that the Conservative Party, they had this golden opportunity to embed, you could say, this sort of almost multi-ethnic, cross-class, pro-Brexit coalition. And the project hasn't really gone according to plan. That's largely because the Conservative Party, in my view, they're quite reluctant to come up with a policy agenda which would be supported by those working class communities. If truth be told, I think they find it very difficult to represent those communities.
Yeah.
It just doesn't come naturally to them at all. But as we've seen, there's been a great deal of incompetence. The government has suffered from many scandals as well. And the current Prime Minister, congratulations for him reaching 100 days. His predecessor didn't come even close to that. But as Tom says, he's not the most inspirational character. I'm not sure if he can really get people going. And I don't think if he can get people, his organisational foot soldiers, local Tory councillors, I don't think he'll be able to get them going either. So the forthcoming general election is not looking good for the Conservative Party, if truth be told.
Yeah, Tom, it's almost if it's funny because Rishi Sunak did support Brexit.
Yeah.
And, he's on record as doing that. But he, as a figure, he almost is the antithesis of the Brexit spirit. He is this kind of dry managerial technocrat.
Yeah, no, completely. And he's someone who doesn't seem to understand that the thing that was brilliant about Brexit, not just as a kind of strategic decision for the UK, not just as a decision about how are we going to relate to our near neighbours and what sort of trade are we going to focus on, but as effectively a kind of populist democratic project. Of course, that's not something that he's on board with. Of course, that's not something that sets his blood racing. It's not entirely clear what does set his blood racing. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that makes Rishi Sunak quite uninspiring figure is the fact that he doesn't really have much in the way of ideology. It was interesting, obviously, he had his interview with Piers Morgan last night, and he really struggles to project any sense of authority whatsoever. Now, you could say that that's just about him as an individual. Some people aren't good public speakers, or some people aren't particularly bolshy public speakers or whatever. But I think a lot of that stems from the fact, what does he actually stand for? Yeah. I think when he was asked, what is Sunakism? He was like, I want people to feel proud in their country, which is fair enough, but who can really disagree with that, apart from some people in the Labour Party, maybe. There are, or general kind of things about, I'm here to get us back on track. I'm here to make things better. So it's this kind
of... He likes families as well.
He likes families, he likes maths. This is about, he wants to make Britain Silicon Valley. These are the few components that we understand. But it's beyond that, you do just get this kind of sense that if you don't really stand for anything, it's very difficult for you to be a dynamic politician and to bring people with you and to hold on to constituencies at your party very, handily at the last election, but in a way that was always something that you had to cement, that you had to kind of make real. So I think a lot of his problems do stem from the fact that he doesn't really stand for anything. And I think the problem that British politics is in at the moment is that on the other side, you also have a kind of a similar figure. We're back to sort of the Labour and the Tories, however much they want to upfront, Tory sleaze and whatever in a slightly pantomimic sort of fashion. They are back to dancing on the head of a pin, really. And that's really quite depressing because, again, one of the great things about Brexit was that period just after the vote when you felt like both parties were about to collapse, where it felt like there was space for something a bit different, something a bit new, where it felt like in the months and years afterwards that at least the existing political parties we had would have to respond to this and realise that those days of choosing between competing flavours of blancmange and sparkling or still was the best that you could possibly do was over. It does feel like we've reset back to like factory setting again, which is quite depressing. And I also think it's depressing because of the fact that those political elites have proven themselves completely incapable of dealing with the crises of our time and crises which are getting worse by the day, it feels like.
And finally, let's move on to Sam Smith. So Smith came out as non-binary in 2019. Until recently, that essentially meant him using they-them pronouns and refusing to be recognised as male in various music industry awards. But this week, in the form of his video for I'm Not Here to Be Friends, we got a glimpse of what Sam Smith sees as an authentic expression of non-binary identity. So Sam Smith looking very glamorous in a sort of sequined outfit. His nipples covered in tassels. There's a bit of water sports going on as well. Rakib, what's your reaction to this? Does it help you understand Sam Smith's non-binary identity?
I'm not interested in knowing about Sam Smith's non-binary identity, and my pronouns, to be honest, are fed up. I've seen very short clips of this music video. It's just like many music videos. There's just a great deal of degeneracy involved, if truth be told. It's very cringeworthy. I do find it distasteful. But I think it really does show that, with this whole, non-binary, transgender, all this and that and all the rest of it. They have incredibly high levels of power and influence within the entertainment industry. That's the truth of it. And I think what you'll actually see as time goes on, there's going to be a growing disconnect between the wider population and the entertainment industry more generally. I've really switched off, to be honest, if truth be told, especially when it comes to this kind of material, if you could call it that. But I do feel that when you're looking at these kind of dynamics at play, I just think that it really shows that, the kind of disconnect between someone like a Sam Smith and probably your average Brit when it comes to these kind of issues and matters of identity.
I mean, Tom, doesn't it just kind of show up that, non-binary isn't really meaningful in any sense?
It's hard to glean particular lessons. I mean, of course, the non-binary thing is fascinating, not least because of people's willingness to go along with it. You know, if Sam Smith can identify however he wants, he can identify as a three-wheel van, as a canary, as whatever he wants. That's completely up to him. But the willingness of people not only to go along with that, to accept that not only can a man become a woman, but a man can become a plural is something entirely different. And I thought it was very interesting this week that you had Richard Madeley of all people, a sort of messenger for a simpler era, it feels like, on Good Morning Britain, having to profusely apologise because he referred to Sam Smith as he, and then also to another, I understand it, non-binary guest on the show as she. Just acknowledging the fact that Sam Smith is male and this guest was female. Like this is the sort of point that we've ended up in. And on the point of it being kind of culturally shocking, whatever, I think there was one particular tweet which said, no one got upset about Like a Prayer, no one got upset about Wrecking Ball, no one got upset about WAP, even though people got upset about all of those things. Because which is quite funny. But there's also a kind of element of this stuff, in a sense, really isn't daring whatsoever. I mean, if you think about the kind of raunch, the kind of controversy stirring sort of gay pop music of the recent past and so on. First of all, a lot of it was a lot better than what Sam Smith is making. I think if anything, his music was never up to much snuff, but I think there is a kind of element of this is all he's got now, is, kind of fighting his culture war, as it were, to be addressed with the pronouns that he wishes to be addressed to.
He used to dress like quite plainly, just in a normal suit, look like your next door neighbour or something.
Yeah, he's been on a journey, as we all have. So it's not necessary. It's, if anything, is kind of, the pose is not kind of two fingers up to society. It's kind of, I dare you not to go along with this. And I think the treatment of Richard Madeley is a good example of that. Because, Sam Smith is an interesting cultural phenomenon to the extent that everything has to kind of bow down around him. He effectively is credited with dissolving the gender categories at the Brit Awards, for instance. He again, heads will roll on national television if people refer to him not in the quote-unquote wrong pronouns. It feels like every newspaper almost instantly and instinctively have gone along with the they thing without giving it a moment's thought. So it's not kind of a sense of rebellion, of pushing back, of being a bit outrageous, but also creating great culture at the same time. The culture, such as it is kind of naff and a bit odd, and it's kind of just daring you to disagree with it rather than actually pushing at any boundaries. If anything, it's kind of suggesting all of the boundaries have kind of been dissolved. And how do you push back against anything in those kinds of circumstances? So whilst, of course, you can understand, the sort of simulated golden shower, the raunch, etc. People are going to see that as inappropriate, particularly for young people, understandably so. But there's also a way in which it's kind of not that daring at the same time, because this is the sort of thing that we're expected to celebrate. And if you dare not celebrate it or not like it, then you've got everything that's coming to you. That's the kind of culture that he operates in now, it feels like. And
Rakib, we know with you're alluding to the sort of power of the trans movement. It seems as if new historical figures are being turned into trans or non-binary as well. It's not just people declaring themselves to be non-binary, but we've heard recently claims from academics that perhaps Jesus Christ was non-binary or trans, or Joan of Arc was presented as non-binary in a recent play at the Royal Shakespeare Company. Again, that had the sort of backing of academics. Queen Elizabeth I has been spoken of as a sort of non-binary figure. I mean, what do you make of that? This kind of reaching back into the past and declaring people to have this identity that seemingly was invented only 5 minutes ago.
I'm just at a loss. I really am. I think that in the case of Jesus Christ, it was someone suggesting that a wound that he had suffered resembled female genitalia. So there's the possibility that he has some kind of trans identity. I think there's a point that I made on one of our previous podcasts. I'm very glad that no one said that about Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. The backlash to that would have really been something. But I think it shows a real desperation in a way, and I think it's actually a form of historical revisionism. In a sense, so I just think that the radical transgender movement, it doesn't, for me, it doesn't bring anything good to the table. Quite the opposite. It's beginning to delve into matters of history, looking to ultimately change just our basic understanding of social order when it comes to matters of identity. I thought that Ella Whelan, one of our columnists here, I thought she was fantastic on Question Time, really pushing back on radical transgenderism, talking about the integrity of sensitive female-only spaces, and it's also very important that it poses a threat to women's sports as well. And I think that we've seen that in recent times. So I'm glad to see that the counter challenge to that is gathering pace, and long may that continue.
Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spiked's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.